Welcome. On behalf of the Susan Mendes Foundation, we have a fabulous program for you that is perfect for Father's Day. We're looking at a grandfather, a father, and a son who all personified the values of respect for human rights, fighting for the underdog, all of the values that Susan Mendes encapsulated in his own life story. Here we honor a rescuer, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who saved all those lives in 1940. And we have been presenting programs on Sundays that reflect on various aspects of Sousa Mendes's legacy. So he was, of course, a diplomat. So we're going to present to you a diplomat, Henry Morgenthau Sr., who also went against orders and stepped outside of what he was asked to do. And he was just concerned about saving lives. So it's just a perfect topic for today, Father's Day. So we have a moderator, and that is my friend and colleague, Dr. Mordechai Paldiel. So he will introduce the program, he'll tell how it came about, and he will introduce our speakers. Mordechai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia. Hello, everyone. Many of us remember years ago the sitcom Dynasty that showed the principal heroes not at their best. Today we have a different dynasty: father, son, and grandson. A US diplomat during World War I, that's Henry Sr., that you see on the left. A US Secretary of Treasury in Roosevelt's administration, that's Henry Jr., and then his son, Robert, a civil rights political advocate. Three persons that one may best describe as a combination of politicians, humanitarians, and civil rights advocates. A combination not always found among political figures. We begin with Henry Morgenthau Sr., and we are pleased to have with us his great-granddaughter to talk about him. She is Dr. Pamela Steiner, a psychologist and senior fellow at the Center for Health and Human Rights at the Harvard School of Public Health, where her work aims to contribute to improving relationships among Armenians, Turks, and Azerbaijanis by identifying and understanding the collective traumas from decades of unresolved conflicts. She has also done conflict resolution work with Germans and Jews, and is Israelis and Palestinians. As she described it in her book, Collective Trauma and the Armenian Genocide, Armenian, Turkish, and Azerbaijani Relations since 1839. Dr. Steiner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mordechai, for that great intro. Thank you, Olivia, and God, how can I forget your name? Michael, both of you have been just tremendously helpful in putting together this presentation. First slide, please. Henry Morgenthau Sr. This first slide sums up his what he's primarily known for. His main role was as U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire from 1913 to 1916. During that time, the United States was still a neutral power in the First World War. His influence was as follows: partly at Morgenthau's urging, the United States joined the Allies in 1917. His influence as ambassador also was, and this is perhaps what he's most well known for, he went outside the ambassadorial role in attempting to stop the Ottoman government from exterminating the Armenian people, and he informed the world of what was going on. The US government under Wilson did not object to his efforts, but they also didn't encourage him or help him with it. History's judgment of Henry Morgenthau Sr. is that his actions gained him love and respect with the Armenian people that is very alive today. And among United States and European historians, they regard him very positively. The exception is a subset of primarily Turkish historians who support the denialist story of denial of committing the Armenian genocide by the Turkish government. Next slide, please. Earliest background. He was born into a well-off family in 1856 in Mannheim, Germany. A well-off, comfortable family. He then experienced some significant change and loss. At the age of 9 in 1866, his father, who was suddenly ruined financially, moves the family from Germany to Brooklyn. His family's development once in Brooklyn was that his father overspent and his mother had to take in boarders. Now, as this was going on in his life, there was the background of the Armenian genocide was underway. The subject Armenian peoples, especially the Christian peoples, the subject Ottoman peoples, especially the Christians, began to demand self-determination and rights. The trend took off with the 1820s Greek War of Independence from the Ottoman Empire, and they were successful in large part. Morgenthau's own life parallels this demand for self-determination and rights in the way that a 14-year-old might begin to put it. And that began with his, back please to the last slide just for a moment. It started with his commitment to be in charge of himself and be good. And here is the proof of that. When he was 14, he wrote in one of his 3 wonderful later books, I composed 24 rules of action, tabulating virtues that I wish to acquire and vices that I must avoid. I even made a chart of these maxims and every night marked against myself whatever breaches of them I had been guilty of. Indulgence in sweets, departures from strict veracity, too much talking, extravagance, idleness, and vanity, a heavy indictment. The fact is that I had acquired an almost monastic habit of mind and loved the conquest of my impulses. Next slide, please. So what else shaped this man long before his ambassadorial assignment? He was very loved by both his parents, and he continued the love toward them, especially to his mother. And his losses, he went through major losses, especially for a kid. He lost a secure, comfortable home in Germany, blissful childhood experiences there, even though he records that he incurred some anti-Semitism. And once in the United States, he learned about how important friendship was. And he became a friend of a hunchback Quaker doctor in Brooklyn who taught him kindness and compassion as he assisted this Quaker doctor in his practice. Here he is some years later with his fiancée. Next slide, please. So 2 characteristics that he developed before his ambassadorial assignment. One was tolerance. As a teenager, he pursued religious tolerance by visiting Christian churches in order to gain understanding. And I believe myself that his ultimate value as a public person was caring about the fate of the Jewish people as his people and growing into caring equally for all people as such. Next slide. Now, in the 19th century, what was going on in the Ottoman Empire was that things got a little better and then they got worse. Sultan Abdul Hamid approved a constitution finally, having been pressured by so many of his subjects. And the constitution made all his subjects equal citizens. But for the Armenians, it was no go. Their situation got worse. And in recognition of this treaty, came out of the Congress of Berlin, which provided for the Armenians to have autonomy in Eastern Turkey, where most of the discrimination, terrible discrimination against them was taking place because the majority of Armenians who were peasants lived in that part of Turkey. But the Sultan was not happy with the way things were going, and he suspended the constitution for the next 30 years. But no matter what he did, the empire continued to slide downward. And meanwhile, there were newly formed Muslim political parties. People wanted representation and participation. And these active political parties strongly blamed the Sultan, and they organized against him. Nonetheless, the discrimination against Armenians increased. And by the 1890s, the Christian Armenians are subjected to very, very large and smaller massacres, especially in the East. And I understand there might have been 100,000 of them killed at that time. Next slide, please. Now, the massacres went on. And in 1909, there was another large massacre of Armenians in Adana in southern Turkey. And this shows a picture of the terrible destruction in the Armenian quarter. Then came the Ottoman Empire in worse shape, the Balkan Wars, and then the World War I starts. Next slide, please. By 1914, Morgenthau was installed as ambassador in Constantinople, which is what he called it. It was also called Istanbul. And he went to Palestine quite quickly. The Jews of Palestine were in trouble because the Jews there and Jews elsewhere were worried that the Ottoman Jews might be on the Ottomans' list for extermination. There was a rumble about the extermination of the Armenians from numerous diplomats, and there was a lot of concern, and it extended to the Jews. And the Turks cut these Jews' communication from the outside world, and they feared the economic strangulation from that cutting would lead to their end. So in New York City, the American Jewish Committee put together some $50,000 in gold for these Jews and sent it to Morgenthau in Constantinople. And my grandfather, Maurice Wertheim, was traveling. He was in Constantinople at the time. My great-grandfather gave it to him, the gold. He put it in his satchel and carried it to the Jews in Palestine. This picture shows Henry Morgenthau and his wife in Palestine. Next slide, please. Now, April 24th was the start date officially. Armenians have designated that as the start of the Armenian genocide. There was plenty of killing before that, but this is the main start date. Next slide, please. And this shows how Armenians were assembled before deportation, because one of the methods for genocide was to send them on death marches from wherever they were in Turkey south to the Syrian desert. And they were called death marches because most of them died before that. Now, in the slide before this, we saw dead Armenians lying on the ground. They were taken out of their towns and villages and simply shot as well. That was another method, just shooting in cold blood. And then the next slide, please. This shows them marching from places in Turkey to the Syrian desert. They're in a line because the people on horseback were Turkish officials and military officers who kept them in line, shot them whenever they wanted. And in the meantime, the Kurds came down from the mountains and picked through the corpses to take the jewelry out. And you should know that the Ottoman government told the Armenians they were being deported temporarily, that they'd be able to return and have their property. They never meant that. The Ottomans took every bit of property and finances away from them, down to wanting the money from their policies for if they were to die, insurance policies in New York. They asked my great-grandfather to insure the money for them. Of course, he didn't do it. but they took absolutely everything and have never given anything back. Next slide, please. Here is a bunch of Armenian widows and children, probably in Syria, I don't know. Next slide. So who was Morgenthau to the Armenians? And I would say in summary, he was famous for acting outside of his official remit based on the values of decency and respect for non-Jewish peoples. He tried to persuade the heads of the Ottoman government not to murder and not to exterminate the Armenians. And he appealed to the State Department to act, not successfully either. But he inspired the raising of considerable sums and goods to help save the Armenians through the Near East Relief Foundation, and it exists today and still raises money for people there. Next slide, please. So he resigned his post in 1916. He was disheartened, literally. He talks about that, from being unable to stop the genocide. And when he returned, he continued to spread the truth of what was going on, not only to the US government, but to the world. He was in touch with the New York Times and so on, and to develop the Near East, the relief for the Near East. Next slide. And my last slide. I ask all of you to consider, what was the essence of this Morgenthau? What attitudes would he have today, not in 1948, but today, were he the US ambassador to Israel? How would he feel regarding the 20% of Palestinian citizens of Israel being treated as second-class citizens, and the maintenance of an occupation and the permitting of settlements in the West Bank through the destruction, among other things, of Palestinian farms and olive groves? Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to a conversation.
Thank you, Ms. Steiner. I'd also like to add that the famous historian Barbara Tuchman was a granddaughter of Henry Morgenthau Sr. So now we continue with the story of Henry Sr.'s son, Henry Morgenthau Jr. And for this, we have the distinguished historian and Holocaust scholar, Dr. RAFAEL MEDOFF. He is the founding director of the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, and the author of more than 20 books about the Holocaust, Zionism, and American Jewish history, including the first scholarly book about the Bergson Group titled A Race Against Death, which he co-authored with the late David Wyman. Dr. Medoff has taught Jewish history at Ohio State University, Purchase College of State University of New York, and elsewhere, and is a fellow of the Finkler Institute of Holocaust Research at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. Dr. Medoff, as we say in Hebrew, bevakasha.
Thank you, Mordechai, and thank you, Olivia, for inviting me to participate in today's program. We saw in the film a very important episode in the life of Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr., in which he helped persuade President Roosevelt to establish the War Refugee Board, a U.S. government agency to help rescue Jews from the Holocaust. In my remarks, I want to share with you two additional episodes that were related to Morgenthau's intervention with Roosevelt, but which were not discussed in the film, but which I would suggest are in fact connected to Morgenthau's ultimate intervention with FDR. The first concerns the well-known refugee ship, the St. Louis, which, as we will recall, in 1939 came from Germany with 930 Jewish refugees and initially attempted to land in Cuba. The ship, of course, was turned away from Cuba, and then after several days sailed northward to the coast of Florida, where it waited, hoping that President Roosevelt would grant the refugees admission to the United States, or, as we will see, to perhaps a U.S. territory. Morgenthau enters the picture in the story of the St. Louis because in Jewish circles in New York at the time, there was, of course, great concern about the fate of these refugees. And a number of Morgenthau's acquaintances apparently in the Jewish leadership, contacted him to see if, as the only Jewish member of President Roosevelt's cabinet, if he could intervene with the president or with Secretary of State Cordell Hull to do something to help these Jewish refugees. Now, you see Hull there on the right. We have a fascinating transcript of a conversation between Morgenthau and Hull from this period, the week that the St. Louis was hovering off the coast of Florida. The reason we have these transcripts, by the way, is that Secretary Morgenthau kept a record of all of his telephone conversations and meetings, which later have turned out to be quite a treasure trove for historians. So we know something about Morgenthau's private intervention with Secretary Hull from this transcript. As you can see in the middle of the page, this conversation took place on June 5th. Morgenthau said to the Secretary of State, Cordell, some of my good friends in New York have called me up about this terrible tragedy, this boat, the St. Louis, with those 900 refugees on it. Now, before we continue with the conversation, I just want to note briefly, Morgenthau was, as I said, the only Jewish member of President Roosevelt's cabinet. And he was also, as the film described in detail, a longtime personal friend of President Roosevelt. But Morgenthau was very self-conscious about the fact that he was the only Jew in the cabinet. And he, as a general rule, did not raise Jewish concerns, Jewish issues with the president. He felt it would have been inappropriate for him, and he was concerned about the public perceiving him as engaging in special pleading for the Jews. So the fact that he approached Hull regarding the St. Louis was itself a very unusual step, and it was, one might say, the first time that Morgenthau's Jewish conscience was troubled to such an extent that he felt comfortable raising the issue with the Secretary of State. Now, if we can look at the next page in the transcript of the Morgenthau-Hull conversation, what we see is that the discussion between the two men went, if you can raise that just a little bit higher, yes, went to the question of whether or not the refugees might be admitted, as you can see, to the Virgin Islands. The Virgin Islands is, of course, a territory, partially U.S. territory, partially British territory. The reason Morgenthau was discussing the Virgin Islands was that 1939, when the St. Louis approached America's shore, was the only year during Roosevelt's entire 12 years in office when the quota, the immigration quota from Germany, was filled. The other 11 of those 12 years, the quota was never filled, and there was a lot of room within the existing quota system to allow more Jewish refugees to come into America from Germany. But it happened that one year, 1939, the quota to admit the refugees into the US was full. That's why Morgenthau was discussing with Hull this issue of the Virgin Islands. If we can go back to the transcript for a moment, the context of this Virgin Islands discussion is that the governor and the legislative assembly of the Virgin Islands publicly offered to open their doors to these Jewish refugees on the St. Louis and other Jewish refugees. That's why they were talking about it. That's why Morgenthau was interested in this possibility. But as we see in the transcript, Hull explained that after discussing the matter with the president, he found it was impossible. And here I want to focus on the reason that we see in this transcript, the reason that Hull gave. And he says, I took that up at once, but I found out that under the law, we couldn't issue tourist visas unless they had a definite home where they were coming from and in a situation to return to it. Now, as we look at those chilling words, I want to explain a little bit what Hull was saying here. In order to admit these refugees from the St. Louis into the into the U.S. territory of the Virgin Islands, they would have had to have been issued, as he says, tourist visas. Tourist visas typically were for 6 months. In order to qualify for a tourist visa under normal circumstances, you had to prove that you had a permanent return, a home address to which you could return in the country from which you came. If we can look at this transcript again for a moment. The problem that these refugees on St. Louis faced is, of course, they did not have a permanent address to which they could safely return because they were fleeing from pogroms in Germany. Remember the Kristallnacht pogrom, which had swept Germany, was just a few months earlier. So they were in a kind of a bind here. They didn't have a place they could go back. And what Hull was saying, and Hull told Morgenthau that he had discussed it with President Roosevelt, what they were telling Morgenthau was they could not allow these refugees on the St. Louis to enter the Virgin Islands because they didn't have a safe place to which they could return. And therefore, they were being turned away and would be sent back to the very unsafe place from which they had come. So you see this horrible catch-22, which doomed the refugees of the St. Louis. Secretary Morgenthau did not feel comfortable pushing the issue past this point. In this instance, in 1939, he in effect took no for an answer. He didn't feel it was his place to press the matter further. But as we saw in the film, by 1944, his willingness to speak out more forcefully came to the fore. What the film described was how, after Morgenthau's staff made him aware of the extent of the mass killing in Europe and the extent of the State Department's obstruction of rescuing refugees, that Morgenthau finally found the wherewithal to directly approach President Roosevelt. What the film did not describe, but which Morgenthau himself many times referred to in meetings with his staff, were the important events that led up to the point where the Secretary of the Treasury was willing to go to the president. Now here I'm referring to the campaign of public protests that was undertaken in the months before Morgenthau went to Roosevelt. So I'm speaking now of the summer and autumn of 1943. A Jewish activist group known as the Bergson Group, its full name was the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, began doing something that was very unorthodox for the American Jewish community at that time. They began taking out full-page newspaper ads in major daily papers like the New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, and Washington Post, in which they directly challenged the Roosevelt administration to do something to help rescue Jews from the Nazis. What you're looking at now are samples of headlines of some of these very jarring ads with their eye-grabbing headlines. The Bergson Group placed more than 200 such ads in major American newspapers during that period. This was critically important to the campaign to rescue the Jews because until the Bergson Group began this newspaper ad campaign, the whole topic of the mass killing of the Jews in Europe was very much in the back pages. Major American newspapers either ignored or downplayed a great deal of the news about the mass killing. So the Bergson Group had to pay for space in those newspapers to bring the issue to public attention and to thereby start putting pressure on the White House, on the Roosevelt administration, to do something about it. If I could have the next slide, please. The ads were only one part of the Bergson Group's campaign of protests. They also, in 1943, 3 days before Yom Kippur, brought more than 400 rabbis to the streets of Washington for a protest march, which was completely unique for that time. In fact, it was the only Jewish protest rally for rescue from the Holocaust to take place in the nation's capital during the Holocaust years. These 400 rabbis marched to the Capitol and then to the White House, hoping for a few minutes of the president's time in order to present him with a petition calling for the creation of a new government agency to rescue Jewish refugees. I'm emphasizing that fact because you'll see in a moment how that ties in to what Secretary Morgenthau did. The rabbis were not allowed even a few minutes of the president's time. They were turned away. The president actually left the White House that afternoon through a rear exit so that he would not see the protesters and they would not see him. But the march garnered very significant publicity, and coming on the heels of all those newspaper ads, added to the public pressure and the public outcry for the administration to do something, for the president to take some step to try to interrupt the mass murder of the Jews or to help rescue some of those refugees. On the heels of its newspaper ad campaign and the march by the rabbis, the Bergson Group then began lobbying in Congress. This was another unique political action tactic for the period, because in those days, the American Jewish community did not have a full-time lobbying group in Washington. Today, of course, we have AIPAC and other Jewish organizations have lobbying efforts in Washington, but that was not the case in the 1940s. So when the Bergson Group began going door to door on Capitol Hill and forging relationships with Republicans as well as Democrats, it was doing something that was almost unheard of in the American Jewish community. In this photograph, we see Peter Bergson, leader of the Bergson Group, on the right, meeting with Senator Guy Gillette, Democrat of Iowa, on the left, and also on the couch, U.S. Congressman Will Rogers Jr., son of the famous entertainer, also a Democrat. I emphasize they were Democrats because Bergson's recruitment of Gillette and Rogers for the rescue campaign made a particular impact on the White House because Gillette and Rogers were loyal supporters of President Roosevelt. They were New Dealers. They were not Republicans or isolationists who were always criticizing Roosevelt and looking for new ways to bash the president or his administration. These were members of Congress from their own camp. Bergson persuaded Gillette and Rogers to introduce a resolution which incorporated the demand that the rabbis made so dramatically on the steps of the Capitol and in front of the White House a few weeks earlier to create a new government agency to rescue Jewish refugees. Again, this was a startling and unusual action for American Jews to take. Think about the context. It was the middle of a world war. They were asking the President of the United States to create a special new government agency to deal particularly with a Jewish concern. This, again, was something that Secretary Morgenthau would not have been instinctively comfortable becoming involved with. But it was precisely at the moment that this resolution was introduced in Congress and hearings were held on Capitol Hill that the other events unfolded, which we saw in the film, which was Morgenthau's senior aides in the Treasury Department, Josiah Du Bois and John Paley and others, coming to him with shocking information about how the State Department had been obstructing opportunities to rescue Jewish refugees and suppressing information about the mass killing of the Jews. In the transcripts of Secretary Morgenthau's meetings with his staff at this time and subsequently, Morgenthau repeatedly acknowledged that it was the public pressure that was being created by the Bergson Group's newspaper ads and marches and lobbying in Congress. Those protests combined with all of the controversy on Capitol Hill over the Gillette-Rogers resolution, which made it possible for Morgenthau to go to the president. What do I mean by made it possible? If Morgenthau had simply gone to the president without the additional factor of all this public pressure, it's entirely possible that President Roosevelt would have seen this as a request, Morgenthau's request, which could be denied without paying much of a political price. Instead, Morgenthau, together with his aides, came to the president in early January 1944, asking for something which was also being demanded by leading members of Congress, by an aroused public, by prominent leaders and members of the American Jewish community. So there was a powerful and growing sentiment in the public arena in support of what Morgenthau was saying. And let's keep in mind the date. The context of Morgenthau's meeting with the president was an election year. It was January 1944. And although today we tend to look at President Roosevelt's re-election campaigns as almost a foregone conclusion because we know the end of that story, in January 1944, FDR and his senior political advisors were not convinced that he was a shoo-in for re-election. They were worried. They expected a serious race in the fall. So When President Roosevelt heard Morgenthau's pleas, he had to say to himself, if he didn't offer Morgenthau and the Jews something, it could turn into an even more serious political controversy, something that no president wants to have during an election year. And so it happened because of this amazing coincidence of circumstances that creating the War Refugee Board was actually the easiest way out for President Roosevelt, the easiest way out of an otherwise thorny political situation and the danger of more controversy. So what Roosevelt did is he told Morgenthau he would agree to Morgenthau's request, which was to unilaterally create a government rescue agency, the War Refugee Board, through executive order. He was not going to wait until Congress embarrassed him by passing that resolution, which Gillette and Rogers were promoting and which was gaining support on Capitol Hill. Instead, Roosevelt simply created the War Refugee Board, but because it was essentially a gesture, not something that Roosevelt wanted at all. In fact, the president had sent his Assistant Secretary of State to Capitol Hill to testify against the Gillette-Rogers resolution. Because it was just a gesture, Roosevelt never gave the War Refugee Board the support it needed. He gave it only token initial funding. In fact, 90% of the War Refugee Board's budget came from private Jewish organizations like the World Jewish Congress and especially from the Joint Distribution Committee. I don't know if there's another example in political history, in American political history, where a government agency was primarily financed by private organizations. But the War Refugee Board was able to carry out its incredible, almost miraculous life-saving activities thanks to funding from Jewish organizations and almost no funding from the White House. The story of the War Refugee Board was, of course, briefly told in the film, so there's no need for me to recount it. But I do want to conclude by suggesting this. Secretary Morgenthau tried in a limited way to help the Jews aboard the St. Louis. He was unsuccessful. And although he did not mention the St. Louis in later conversations, I would be surprised if it did not, in fact, haunt him in some way that he had been unable at that time in 1939 to help save them. And I would imagine that as he looked at what he was learning in 1943 and 1944, that it was perhaps the failure of his intervention with the St. Louis that helped give him the courage to then take the unprecedented step in 1944 of directly confronting the president, and by doing so, helping to change history. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Medoff. Now we come to Robert Morris Morgenthau, son of Henry Jr. And as you undoubtedly saw more of him in the film Morgenthau, I will only recapitulate the main points about this interesting person. But first, just a few words about myself. From 1982 to 2007, I led the Righteous Among the Nations department at Yad Vashem and wrote many books and articles on this topic. More recently, I taught at Yeshiva University and Torah College, and I currently serve on the board of the Susan Mendes Foundation, as well as on the B'nai Brit committee in Israel that honors Jewish rescuers of Jews during the Holocaust. I have lately also succeeded in having a square in Jerusalem named after Aristides de Souza Mendes. Now to Robert Morgenthau. He was born in 1919 in New York City, son of Henry Morgenthau Jr. During World War II, he served for 4.5 years in the US Navy, where he attained the rank of lieutenant commander. After the war, Morgenthau graduated from Yale Law School in 1948 and joined an important New York law firm. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy appointed Robert Morgenthau as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and he served in that capacity for the remainder of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. In January 1969, following the election of President Richard Nixon, for months, Morgenthau resisted public pressures from the Nixon administration to resign. Morgenthau and his supporters claimed that Nixon might be seeking to prevent him from pursuing investigations that would prove embarrassing to the president or his friends. He was eventually forced out of office at the end of 1969. Afterwards, Morgenthau served briefly in the administration of New York Mayor John Lindsay as a deputy mayor and resigned in 1970. He returned to public life in 1974 as the elected New York County District Attorney and was continually re-elected for 25 years until 2009 at the age of 89. He was succeeded in office by Cyrus Vance Jr., the son of former President Jimmy Carter's Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance. At retirement, Morgenthau was the longest serving district attorney in the history of the state of New York. Morgenthau's office prosecuted many criminal and murder cases, including the Central Park jogger case, where 5 teenage suspects were wrongly convicted of assaulting and raping a 28-year-old woman in the north section of Central Park. After Morgenthau's office investigated the confession in 2002 by another man, including finding that his DNA matched evidence at the scene, he recommended vacating the convictions of the 5 men and dismissal of charges, which the court accomplished. His office also prosecuted top white-collar executive officers. Persons who served under Robert Morgenthau as Assistant District Attorney included the following: Sonny R. Sotomayor, the current Associate Justice of the Supreme Court; Andrew Cuomo and Elliot Spitzer, 2 future governors of New York State; John F. Kennedy Jr., son of President John F. Kennedy; Robert F. Kennedy Jr., son of Senator Robert F. Kennedy; and Cyrus Vance Jr., son of Cyrus Vance, who was Secretary of State under President Jimmy Carter. Robert Morgenthau was involved in various civil rights organizations, such as with Martin Luther King's movement. And here I have to remind the audience today, which is called June the 19th, or the 9th of June, in which we celebrate the liberation of the slaves here in the United States, quite very late in the history of this country. So this is a good occasion to mention Robert Morgenthau's associations with Martin Luther King. And he was also associated in a number of civic activities, including the chairman of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. In 2016, he received the Leo Baeck Medal, the institution that deals with the Jewish heritage in Germany, from where his own family originated. Finally, as to his personal life, he was married first to Martha Patridge, and they had 5 children. She died in 1972, and 5 years later, in 1977, he married Lucinda Franks, an author who in 1971 won a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting, and they had 2 children. Robert Morgenthau died in 2019, short of his 100th birthday. Dr. Olivia Mattis, president of the Susan Mendes Foundation, will now tell us more about the foundation and some future programs, and then take questions from the audience. Olivia, the floor is yours.
So there are quite a few questions accumulating. I do urge you to continue putting your questions into the chat box for our speakers. I also have to mention that today's program came about, I don't know if this was mentioned, when Mordechai went to Milan, Italy, when Susan Mendes was inducted into the Garden of the Righteous in Milan. And there he met a member of the Morgenthau family, because Robert Morgenthau Sr. was also being posthumously inducted into that garden because of his work on behalf of the Armenians. So it was out of that trip that Mordechai took, and our conversations together, and my discovery that there was this film, that this program took shape. So I think it's important for you all to know that. So today is the last program of our spring season. We're then going to take a hiatus until July 24th. So I do hope you'll join us again then. And let me entice you by telling you some of the programs to come. On July 24th, we're featuring the story of this village in France called Chabannes, where there was an orphanage run by a principal and some teachers, three of whom were named Righteous Among the Nations by Yad Vashem. They were part of a larger organization in France called OSE, pronounced OZE, whose mission was to rescue the Jews of France. In this case, they were not French Jews, they were German Jewish refugees living in France who were at this particular orphanage. And there's such a delightful film called The Children of Shaban that we will play you the trailer in a minute. That film was made by the daughter of one of the children who was sheltered there. The week following, we have Dr. RAFAEL Medoff coming back to tell us about his expertise. You see the poster behind him, Cartoonists Against the Holocaust, which is this book that he wrote. He also wrote this fabulous book called We Spoke Out, Comic Books and the Holocaust, and other books, also graphic novels and books about graphic novels to do with cartoonists who spoke out against the Holocaust. So we're bringing you that subject on at the end of July 31st, I guess it is. And RAFAEL will be joined by a New York Times reporter who specializes in comic books and graphic novels. So that will be a delightful program. It'll be free of charge. And so I hope you and all of your friends will sign up. The following week, we turn to the hero Jan Karski. And here again, we have RAFAEL Medoff, who is an expert, but he's not on that program. We have Michael Berenbaum, we have Mordechai Paldiel, we have Abraham Foxman, we have a member of the Jan Karski Educational Foundation who are co-sponsoring the program. And that also will be very important. We'll be showing a film called Jan Karski and the Lords of Humanity. So those are programs to come. I do hope you will sign up. There'll be information coming your way through email. And right now we're going to see a trailer of the film, The Children of Shaban.
They were refugees and orphans, children of the war.
I arrived in Shaban in 1941 on a very cold day, a very sad little girl.
Rescued by a small French village that knew neither prejudice nor hate.
We were German, Jewish children in a community that probably had never seen any Germans before, probably never seen any Jewish kids before.
They were nurtured, schooled, and protected from a force determined to see them die.
We seemed in an insulated enough place, not so much isolated, but insulated enough place. We did not feel the fear until that big bus came, the police bus.
From documentary filmmakers Lisa Gossels and Dean Wetherell, the story of extraordinary people who risked their lives to save other people's children.
Ce temps pour moi, c'est un temps lumineux, d'amour pour enfants, d'amitié. Vous savez, c'est un temps lumineux, malgré le temps difficile comme c'était.
All right, there are a lot of questions and we don't have terribly much time, but we'll get to as many as we can. So question number one, why did the refugees on the St. Louis need tourist visas? Was there no program for asylum or refugee status seekers?
Before I turn this over to Medoff, they had already been approved for immigration to the United States under the quota, but they had to wait their turn like for 2 years for their number to come up. So they decided that they were going to spend the 2 years as tourists in Cuba, and that's why they took the St. Louis boat there. Am I right, RAFAEL?
Yes, but I'd just like to add that at that time, there was no concept of asylum in American immigration law. Jews who were escaping from the Holocaust and applying for permission to enter the United States were considered along with everyone else around the world who was interested in moving to the United States. The fact that you were a victim of political or racial or religious persecution was not taken into consideration at all. And this was something which Jewish organizations at the time raised. This was a concern of theirs that they urged the administration to treat victims of persecution differently, but the Roosevelt administration refused to make any such a distinction.
Next question is, why did Henry Morgenthau Jr. Not use his influence with Roosevelt to urge him to bomb the railroad tracks leading to the death camps? Why did that not happen?
A number of Jewish organizations in the summer and fall of 1944 raised this question of bombing either the crematoria at Auschwitz or the railways and bridges leading to Auschwitz, over which Jews were being deported to that death camp. Requests that were made for such bombing were sent to the War Department. Today we call it the Defense Department, but they were sent to the War Department. So although Morgenthau was aware of the fact that these Jewish groups were asking for this, his department and the War Refugee Board were not directly involved in any of the deliberations on the issue. So these requests were sent to the War Department, where they were all summarily rejected with the equivalent of a form letter, which gave disingenuous reasons as to why the bombing could not be carried out. So it's simply a matter that Morgenthau was not part of the chain of command to which along which such requests would be channeled.
Okay. Well, so there's so many connections between the different stories that we present. So someone wants to know, did Henry Morgenthau Jr. meet with Jan Karski? Did he get cables from the Ladosh Group in Bern, Switzerland?
I'm not aware of any contact between Karski and Morgenthau. When Karski came to the United States in 1943, he met with a number of important public figures, including, as we know, of course, President Roosevelt. But he, as far as I know, he did not meet with Secretary Morgenthau. I've never seen any documentation of that. What was the second part of the question?
Well, Mordechai is one of the world's expert on this group in Switzerland called the Ladosh Group that were busy sending cables to America. So Mordechai, do you know if they were connected, if Morgenthau ever got cables from this group in Switzerland?
Well, the cables were sent out by Jewish rescue activists from the Polish legation in Switzerland, in Bern. And they were sent out by the Polish diplomatic transmitter. It landed in New York, where the Poles had an office. And in New York, leaders, Dr. Yitzhak Levine from Agudat Israel picked up the information and turned it over to the heads of Agudat Israel. Agudat Israel then called the State Department, and they tried to get them interested in that. I'm talking about the middle of 1943. I am not aware that these cables reached the desk of Henry Morgenthau for the simple reason that the Agudat Israel was trying to get Cordell Hull, trying to get the Secretary of State to get involved in order to allow more refugees to come in. And at that time in 1943, as Medoff mentioned, Henry Morgenthau Jr. was not yet involved. That was before the War Refugee Board story, which came up a little bit later. So I don't think that he was involved in these cables. He didn't even know about them, maybe.
And then a final question about Henry Jr. About actually FDR. This is a question about FDR. Why was FDR not supportive of the War Refugee Board that he felt he had to create due to pressure?
Well, I guess the question helps provide us with part of the answer. President Roosevelt and his administration did not want to create a government rescue agency to help the Jews. This was something that they opposed because they did not want to expend even minimal government resources on trying to rescue Jewish refugees. When Congressman Gillette and Rogers proposed this rescue resolution, as I mentioned, the administration sent its Assistant Secretary of State, Breckinridge Long, to Capitol Hill to testify against it. So the White House and the State Department did everything they could to prevent this rescue agency from coming into existence. When FDR finally felt that politically it was the convenient or best option, then he did so very reluctantly, and precisely because he never wanted it and didn't even want to create it, and it had been forced to, in effect. He certainly was not going to give it more than the most token of funding.
So Pamela, Dr. Steiner, what's it like to be a member of this unbelievable dynasty?
I guess I just take it for granted. Can I comment on what's been said a little bit so far? That my great-grandfather also did not want to be identified, resisted taking the post to Constantinople for quite a long time. Woodrow Wilson had to pressure him a lot. And the reason was he didn't want to go to what was called the Jewish post, presumably because it was so near Palestine. So it sounds to me as though Henry Jr. had a little bit of that as well. And that was probably quite a complicated set of non-commitments, as it were, more than maybe we have time to talk about today. But I think that's quite interesting. I also wonder, Raphael and anyone else, why Henry Morgenthau Jr. didn't take more initiative. You know, it's one thing to say this didn't reach his desk, that didn't reach his desk. But he was a person who had a capacity to learn things and find out and go and ask, and he didn't. So that's of some interest. And, you know, it's probably a back and forth between who he was and what the pressures at the time were. I mean, what I could talk a long time about the family and what it's like. It's nice.
Raphael, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I think it's exactly what Pamela just put her finger on, that for Henry Morgenthau Jr., it seems from my reading of the documents and interviews with his descendants that there was a constant struggle going on inside him between his Jewish conscience and his concern about his friendship with President Roosevelt, his fear about how the public would perceive him, his role as the only Jew in Roosevelt's cabinet. So it seemed as if he was constantly struggling between those conflicting concerns and pressures. And that may help explain why he wasn't consistently a vocal advocate for the Jews within Roosevelt's cabinet. But yet at the moment when he was most needed, he did find the courage to become exactly such an advocate.
Now we will run over by a few minutes. I hope the audience will indulge our speakers because there's still some questions to get to, and then they have their final thoughts. So there's a question about the Jewish identity of the family. I know it's a large family. I know that Robert Morgenthau was one of the founders, as Mordechai said, of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. The question is, what is the nature of the family's Jewish identity and beliefs, starting with Henry Sr.? Did they live within an active Jewish community? Were they members of a congregation? Were they involved with Jewish institutional life? And finally, what was their involvement with the state of Israel?
Am I supposed to answer that or start to answer it?
Go ahead.
The fact is that I think that the connection to being Jews in all of these different possible ways you mentioned is all over the place in the family. Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s first wife was not Jewish. My first husband was not Jewish. Our second spouses were Jewish. And I think that Henry Morgenthau's third, who was Robert's brother and a distinguished person in his own right, married a woman who was a refugee from Germany, Ruth Morgenthau, a distinguished professor at Brandeis. And he became quite religious or active in the Harvard Jewish community after that. They lived in Cambridge and he became head of Harvard Hillel, and so on. So it is truly all over the place. I don't know much that everybody has a strong identification as Jews, I would say, all of us. I don't know anyone who does not, but it doesn't mean we're equally active in various enterprises. Certainly my own commitment to working for peace and understanding, which is just and fair, it's not just sweetness and light by any means, is inspired by the family background, but particularly my mother, who worked for disarmament, nuclear disarmament all her life. And she was the direct granddaughter and the sister of Barbara Tuchman. And the other sister, my other aunt, and there were the three daughters of Alma Morgenthau Wertheim. My other aunt was very well known as an environmentalist. So the concerns are deep to the public interest, but to different sectors in the public interest. I've written an article about the various members of the family, how they came out.
Anything more to say from Mordechai or Raphael about that question of the Jewish identity of any of these Morgenthaus?
No, I think she has already said that. But don't forget that we're living in a period where here in the United States, Jewish persons did not try to display their Jewishness. It was a general feeling among Jews that not that you hide your Jewishness, but you become fully integrated into the melting pot of America, which means not to display too much of, but everybody knew that they were Jews, of course. There's no question about it.
But could I just add to that, that I think there was a divide among Jews on this, because many Jews remained very committed to Jewishness for quite a while, although it slowly went away. But there was a class distinction as well. The Morgenthaus became upper class, with Henry Morgenthau Sr.'s made a lot of money before he became ambassador, and they were very smart and became well educated, and they were German Jews, and they thought of themselves as better than Jews from Russia, for example. So I think there was a class distinction at work here as well.
Okay. Well,
Okay,
so,
so can we go on now? I guess, Pam, we're going now to the final thoughts. You want to add anything further? No. So I'm going to ask Raphael, final thoughts of you about Henry Jr. Anything you want to add?
You know, I'm often asked when I lecture on this topic, isn't it ironic that Morgenthau, who was Jewish, was so reluctant to speak out on Jewish concerns, and it was his staff who were Protestant lawyers who were the ones that convinced him and pushed him and prodded him to confront President Roosevelt. But when I read some of the later interviews with the key staff members, Josiah Du Bois and John Paley, I was struck by something very interesting. At one point, in an interview with Josiah Du Bois that was conducted by the filmmaker Marty Ostro, Du Bois was asked about this point. Isn't it ironic that you weren't Jewish? Why were you so concerned about it? And Du Bois kind of bristled at the question, and he said, "You don't have to be Jewish to care about what's happening to innocent people who are being massacred." He said, it was, I'm just paraphrasing here, Du Bois felt it was his moral obligation as a decent human being to do what he did, which in his case was risking his job, risking his career in his clashes with the State Department and in his efforts to get Secretary Morgenthau to take a more active posture on this issue. So for Du Bois, it was completely natural that even though he wasn't Jewish, of course he cared about Jews or anybody else who was being persecuted. And I personally find that rather inspiring, because, you know, the story of America's response to the Holocaust is mostly a story of abandonment, as the title of Professor David Wyman's famous book reminds us, The Abandonment of the Jews. But there's also another part of this story, and that is of the minority of Americans, Jews and non-Jews, who did speak out, who did try to do something during that terrible time. And it is to them to those who spoke out that I look as moral exemplars, as the
Mhm.
people who inspire me, and I hope it will inspire others. Because unfortunately, genocide did not end with the Holocaust. And every generation of Americans ultimately has to face this question: should the United States try to do something to help persecuted people in other parts of the world? And my hope as a historian and as a human being is that the chief lesson we will take away from the Morgenthau experience, both with the Armenians and during the Holocaust, is yes, we should try to do something.
Okay, thank you. And now I will add a few lines of myself. So I can only add to these interesting thoughts that we have before us the lineage of father, son, and grandson, who represent one of the best examples of 3 generations of persons who added a moral dimension to their professional and political careers, and who emphasized the positive side in human relations. I believe, and I may not be the only one, that the story of Henry Morgenthau Sr., who went beyond the simple duties of a diplomat in a foreign country by fighting against the genocide of the Armenians as well as the Greeks by the Ottoman Empire, coupled with the story of his own son, Henry Morgenthau Jr., who challenged the US president, a very popular US president, the leader of the alliance against Hitler, in a confrontation that led Roosevelt to create the War Refugee Board that caused the rescue of tens of thousands of Jews. That these humanitarian actions by his forebears, I believe, had an important impact on Robert Morgenthau's own behavior and activities in the cause of human rights. So the 3 Morgenthaus are the pride of among the best in modern US history and the cause of what is termed in German Zivilcourage, or civil courage. And no less, they rank among the most eminent and distinguished personalities in Jewish history as well. Well, we all feel proud of their accomplishments as Americans, as Jews, and as humanitarians. Olivia, your final words.
Pamela, was there something you wanted to say in closing? I don't know if you had the opportunity.
Well, only that I would say that the reality of transmitted trauma is present in this gathering, but so is the reality of transmitted humanitarianism, and that these very important deep factors stay alive across generations.
Great. And I wanted to remind everybody that the Sousa Mendes Foundation is a nonprofit 501c3 organization. If you do support us, it's 100% tax deductible. You will get an email after today's program that has a donate button. And aside from bringing you these Sunday programs, we also interview survivors. We also mount exhibitions. We also create publications. We also have a graphic novel. Speaking of graphic novels, and so much more. We have an education committee that's creating materials for the schools. So please do support us. We do have the opportunity we are offering something called half season tickets. If you want to sign up for the rest of the year with a one-time cost, and you won't have to worry about registration deadlines or anything of that nature. You will automatically be signed up for everything. So these are all ways to support us. We do very much appreciate your attendance, your support, and your goodwill. And of course, happy Father's Day to all of the fathers out there. And my own father, if you're out there, as you sometimes are on our programs, I'll call you later. Happy Father's Day to all. Be well. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Bye-bye.